Joe's Inner Child Podcast.
Welcome back. Today we speak with Dean Hamer, who is a geneticist, an author, and a filmmaker. So while we speak to him about his new documentary animation, Kapaemahu, we also dive a bit into his work with Dr. Fauci, doing scientific research on sexual orientation. We learned a lot, and it was definitely a very enlightening chat. So I'm sure you guys will take a lot away from it. Enjoy!
Literary Joe's Inner Child Podcast.
Dean, so nice to officially COVID meet you, quarantine. I am Joe, although not your Joe. I am a Joe, and this is Nick, co-host, and we are excited to talk with you. We already spoke with Joe, and I didn't realize you guys were married. I knew you guys were a team, and I've seen interviews where you guys have spoken together, but I didn't understand that you guys were partners in that sense. So I kind of wanted to ask, how does your own experience help deliver the message that you're trying to get across with your animation?
You know, I think that Joe and I have a really amazing partnership. We came from very different walks of life. I actually spent most of my life as a scientist, a molecular biologist. I worked at the National Institutes of Health. Tony Fauci was my boss for many years. And so it was a very different world. And Joe came from the world of human rights and nonprofit organizations. So we came to filmmaking from completely different angles. But what drew us together really was our love for one another, because our first film was about what happened after we got married and all the exciting complications that happened in Joe's little hometown. So unlike maybe some couples that came up in the same industry and then hooked up that way, we were actually brought together by our interest in communication. So it's been a really great collaboration, and we've managed to sort of carve out little bits of filmmaking that are unique for each of us. And for me, it's hard to imagine going through all the trouble and the trauma and the pain and the agony of making a film without somebody to do it with. So I feel really lucky that we've been able to work together in that way. And it's taken us from, very different places and very different topics. And here we are in Hawaii working with somebody like Hina. And it's been a really fun ride.
And even before you guys got into filmmaking, you are a writer, right? You have written books. Can you tell me a little bit about tell me about the message that you were providing through that medium before you got into directing?
Well, as a scientist, I worked on many topics, but one of them was the role of genetics in human sexuality. And the whole question of, is there a gay gene, or why are people the way that they are sexually? And that, of course, took me out of the realm of pure science into the realm of politics and society. And it's a topic that people are interested in, not because of the science, but because it's about sexuality. And it kind of struck me that the mainstream media didn't do a great job of explaining that. So I started thinking, maybe I should try to figure out how to write about this or how to talk about this in a way that can be understood. And that's what brought me into writing, and also made me interested in movies as a way of talking about complicated ideas without just explaining them from a scientific point of view, explaining them in a way people could understand.
I love that answer. You'd mentioned movies. Were you initially interested in doing live action, or did you always know that you kind of wanted to go in an animation route once you and Joe started working together?
Animation came relatively late for us because our first work was all in the area of documentary, and it almost started more like newscasting. We wanted to get the message out. And then gradually we realized that news is interesting, but it's more interesting when people realize the human connection and have characters and stories that they can follow. So that led us to sort of character-based documentaries. And animation came about because there were bits of history, Hawaiian history, we wanted to tell. And we realized just talking about them was boring. And we couldn't do it any other way. We couldn't do it live action because everyone's, it was thousands of years ago.
Uh-huh.
And so in a way, animation was like, initially we started with like still pictures, old pictures, and that was kind of boring to just listen to somebody talking and you keep looking at the same picture and you can only do so many zooms. And we were like, maybe we could do an animation and bring it alive that way. And that's what really got us started. We were incredibly, I don't know if Joe told you this story, but our first animation was with a film about Hina called Kumu Hina. Mm-hmm. And we wanted to tell the story of Mahu. And Joe and I went to a place called the Pacific Culture Center in Hawaii, which has a cartoon as part of their evening show. And this show is run by the Mormon Church. It's a supportive thing that supports the Mormon Church. They tell a version of the history of Hawaii that's really not at all true. They say it started with one man and one woman and they had a baby and then they went to heaven. It's ridiculous. But the animation was beautiful and looked very Polynesian. And we actually found the student who had done that animation and got that student to work on our project to tell the story of Mahu and, another version of the history of Hawaii. And that's kind of how we got started in animation. So it wasn't for love of the art, but as we saw how well it told the story, we got to love it more and more. And I'll just say that in that film, Kumihina, the film did well. It was on PBS. It won a bunch of awards. But that little 1.5 minutes of animation, that was the most popular part of that film. It got like 1 million views on Facebook. And that made us realize, oh, this is a cool way to tell stories.
And I love that you had mentioned I think it's interesting that you had mentioned still pictures and originally, telling stories on still pictures, because I had mentioned to Joe that I feel like when I watch the animation, it's got almost like a motion comic quality to it where like the background is almost set, but there's like certain movement, the characters, will move. And I love the way that it comes across. I think that by doing it in animation instead of a documentary, you're able to share your perspective with people who might reject it if it's coming out of your mouth as words of science or as words that you believe. Somebody sees something in a story, and internally, I feel like sometimes I get a message that I don't even realize is a message that's trying to be told to me, a message that I only understand because I can relate to a story. So I think what you guys are doing is incredibly important. I wanted Nick to ask a couple questions because I don't stop talking.
Yeah, so my ears kind of perked up a bit when I heard that you were into science. And when I was in school, I was big into chemistry and I was in an engineering program, and now I'm writing. So I kind of get where you're coming from and switching fields. But I noticed that, science it's a very, for the most part, rigid education in that, like, there's, you're learning about the cells, you're learning about mixtures, there's going to be a formula somewhere. Was it a weird transition coming from a world of science to a world of filmmaking where everything is there's so much room for ambiguity and like freedom of creativity?
It was kind of fun. And I never did go to film school. I took a weekend course at Howard University. That was only 2 days. And I was fortunate that we were able to hook up with people that were really good, a really good editor, a really good camera person, and now a really amazing animator with Daniel Sousa, and to learn from them in that way. And I do feel, though, that like telling a story, it's something that scientists do too, because we're always looking at the facts and trying to make it into a coherent narrative so we know how A led to B led to C. And in a way, making films is all about the same idea of a narrative. So I never felt like there was a complete disconnect. And we've yet to make anything that would really be a fictional film or a narrative. And I'm not sure I'm ever going to be able to do that. But we love telling stories where we already have some idea of what is A and what is B.
That's awesome. If there was a possibility for a fictional type of story to be told that would fit within the realm of what you're trying to tell, if it's a similar message to Kapaemahu or anything that needs to be said, would you ever consider something like that?
Absolutely. And we had been thinking about a story about Aikane, which is the Hawaiian term for same-sex lovers, or what we would call gay folks. There are many, many famous iconi, including Kamehameha himself, the great Kamehameha, but no one single story. So we often think about what would be a great way to wind those together into something that would feel like Brokeback Mountain, but with a happy ending, perhaps, and how to do that. I've been mulling that over for years now and still just barely getting down a few words on paper. So it's an interesting process because in a way you think, oh, fiction film, you can do whatever you want. You can make it come out however you like. But in a way, it's harder than telling a story that you already know the ending to. So
I agree.
we're still struggling with that.
Trust me, 3 words is good. As a creative who's got tons of stories in my head, 3 words is better than nothing. Trust me, as long as you're making progress, you're making progress, if that makes sense.
Oh.
But I was also curious, before I hand it off to Joe, firstly, I wanted to say, great film. I love it. The message is great. And I can't wait to see it take off even more once we get our coverage out. But also, I was wondering about, as you learned about the topic, like, was it something that you didn't know anything about at all? Like, how much of this experience, I guess what I'm trying to say, was new to you?
You know, I had heard the stories about Mahu because of working with Hina for so long. So the ancient history, I wasn't that surprised by. What surprised me more was the ways that even in recent times, starting in the 1960s and 70s and 80s and 90s, and how in even recent times the story had been changed and suppressed. Because so often we think of the history, especially of colonized places like Hawaii, as they had a wonderful history, and then along came the missionaries and the colonizers in the 1800s, and they were bad and they did everything terrible. And then since then, it's been a struggle to recover. But in fact, that suppression really continued through modern times. And a lot of the suppression of this story happened recently. So in 1905, when the story was first written down, it was all about Mahu and how they were bisexual or unsexed by nature, and how they were both like men and females. And it was only in the 1960s that people started squelching that. And in fact, that was a time when there was a lot of prejudice against Mahu. Mahu, who worked in the show industry, were forced to wear buttons that said, "I am a boy." Imagine having to wear a button that identifies your sexuality or your gender. It was really horrific. And even in the 1990s, when the stones were being restored and people recognized their healing powers, they wouldn't say that it had anything to do with Mahu. And it was a time when Hawaii was having horrific battle over same-sex marriage. The Mormon Church came in and funded all these advertisements that had said gay people are terrible, and it's like marrying your dog and all types of stuff. So that was really interesting to me, because we think of this type of suppression as something long ago in the past, and it's really continued up to the present day. So yeah, that was an interesting history to uncover.
Yeah, definitely. That is a lot to take in for sure. I mean, I never knew any of that, so it's good to know now, because I can look at other things with an even more open mind than I did already. So I'm going to pass it off back to Joe, because I'm sure he's got a ton of more questions.
Sure.
Yeah,
Thanks,
actually, that was great, Nick. But I like the things that you were talking about with the Mormon Church and everything, because it brings me to the difference between religion and culture, because people often blur the line and kind of view it as the same thing because it gets passed down. But so much in religion, not to knock anybody's faith, but so many messages in religion are what you're not supposed to do, And with culture, like the culture that you're exploring, this is something that dates back so much further than modern religion, and where people accepted you for who you are. People supported you for who you are. And somehow, I mean, not somehow, I think that religion, honestly, some main religion is a big part of why that got lost through the ages. I'm curious